in July 1917, a slim pamphlet called Two Stories was sent to 134 private subscribers in London. It was the first publication of the Hogarth Press, hand typeset that is, and hand-bound by Leonard and Virginia Woolf themselves. It contained, as it says, two stories, a short story by each of them, each by Leonard and Virginia Woolf. Virginia's story was called The Mark on the Wall and has been almost continuously in print from that day that it appeared in 1917. Leonard's story, by contrast, has never been commercially republished. It was called Three Jews, and Leonard Woolf himself was, of course, Jewish. Written in 1915, it tells the story of a Londoner who wakes up one morning on the first day of spring and feels restless. So he takes himself off to Kew Gardens, which is the botanical gardens in London, to get some fresh air. And afterwards, he wanders into a tea shop garden for a cup of tea. And as he sits there, another man wanders in, and since all the other tables are taken, asks if he can join him. As he speaks, the narrator notices, quote, the slight thickness of the voice, the overemphasis, and the little note of assertiveness in it. He says, of course, he doesn't mind at all, but seeing the man's dark head against the delicate apple blossom and the pale blue English sky, he smiles. "You're amused," the man said, "and I believe I know why." "Yes," I said, says the narrator. "You knew me at once, and I knew you. We show up, don't we, under the apple blossom and this sky. It doesn't belong to us, does it? Do you wish it did?" "Ah," he said seriously, "that's the question. Or rather, we don't belong to it. We belong to Palestine still. But I'm not sure that it doesn't belong to us for all that." "Well," says the narrator, "perhaps your version is truer than mine, I'll take it. But there's still the question, do you wish you belonged to it?" Now, this conversation at the beginning of the story concerning their mutual sense of feeling outsiders, of not belonging socially and physically, we show up, don't we, under the apple blossom, and the inevitable question that follows, where they do belong to, is one of the central things that interests me about this story. While it hovers ambivalently around the question of whether they do belong to it, that is, to England, the second Jew repeats the refrain that I've already cited, we belong to Palestine still. And he then tells another story, which is in fact somewhat inconsequential, of a third Jew, a cemetery keeper, who nevertheless, he affirms, also belongs to Palestine still. What interests me here is not just the uncertainty that the men feel about whether they belong to England, but also the insistence that they belong to Palestine still. And the question is particularly interesting in the story because the story was published in July 1917. That is, just 4 months before the British Foreign Secretary of the day, Arthur James Balfour, wrote his letter to the Baron Rothschild for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland, which came to be known as the Balfour Declaration. So predating the declaration, the story suggests a scenario that the Balfour Declaration, despite its qualification with respect to the, quote, civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, transformed dramatically. The phrase in the story, we belong to Palestine, is striking, I think. So different from its obverse, Palestine belongs to us. And you could say, in fact, that the whole history of the Middle East in the 20th century has in some sense revolved around that semantic reversal from we belong to Palestine to the exclusivist claims of Palestine belongs to us. If Arab and Jewish populations of Palestine had been able to think their relation or negotiate their relation to Palestine in terms of the first kind of belonging rather than the second, then Israel-Palestine might now be a country of peace rather than the unhappy, divided, and violent entity that it's become. Leonard Woolf's phrase, we belong to Palestine, seems to envisage a Palestine in which diaspora Jews in London, Mizrahi Jews and Arabs in Palestine can all belong to the same place, be part of a shared space to which they feel they all belong. Just as today Londoners or New Yorkers, in their extraordinary ethnic, religious and cultural diversity, feel that they belong to London or New York. Above all, perhaps, in this context, London. I think it's no coincidence that it was in London that Daniel Barenboim met Edward Said. We don't really need to think back to Cordoba. In some sense, London is the modern Cordoba, you could argue. Woolf, you might say, anachronistically envisages a one-state solution, assuming the mixed, diverse cultural environment that was in fact already there, the norm in the Middle East, still populated by the diverse cultures under the Ottoman Empire, not only in Palestine, of course, but in cities like Smyrna, Alexandria, and elsewhere. The, quote, land without borders, reimagined recently by Raja Shehadeh in his book, A Rift in Time, Travels with My Ottoman Uncles. All of that was irrevocably lost when the principles of nationalism were enforced by the great powers in 1922, after which the human and humane fluidity and open borders of the Ottoman Empire were gradually frozen into the boundary prisons of the modern nations or non-nations in the Middle East. And the shrinking remains of that earlier world was the milieu in which Edward Said grew up. And it was his sense of belonging to Palestine still that would fuel the focus and commitments of his life in a time when the very question of whether he or other Palestinians belonged to Palestine had become a contested issue. As he grew older, Said was translated into an era when even to cite the very name of Palestine bizarrely became a forbidden or heretical act. In 2001, for example, not so long ago, the then British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw found himself in the middle of a political storm on a tour of the Middle East because he had used the term Palestine. Ariel Sharon responded by refusing to meet him, clearly unaware of the historical irony of his outrage at a British Foreign Secretary daring to use the P word. The attempt to erase the very word Palestine was a kind of negative metonymy that points to a much larger material, cultural, and human erasure. The Palestine to which the earlier British Foreign Secretary Balfour had referred 84 years before had disappeared, no longer existed even in name, no longer could even be referred to in diplomatic circles. It's that evanescence of a place, its identity, its communal life, and the fate of the majority of its Arab inhabitants that was to preoccupy Said, whose courageous stubbornness, which we might call samud, his steadfastness throughout his life, was to insist on using that anachronism, the word Palestine, the Palestine to which he'd belonged, and which he continued to claim that he belonged to, even if it no longer existed and he was told that he had no right to belong to it. The question that Said could not avoid was, given the official disappearance of Palestine, what or where did he belong to? The boundaries of Palestine have changed throughout history, of course, but the former territory of Palestine under the British Mandate, under which Said grew up, changed at least 3 times in his life, in 1948, in 1967, and 1995. And the Oslo Agreement, in particular, with its Palestinian-administered territories and strange Bantustan-like scattering of a myriad of tiny Palestinian areas within a West Bank still occupied by Israel, was perhaps the most bizarre development of all in terms of memory of an actual Palestine. For Said, Palestine had been indisputable, real. He was there. But it existed no longer, though the physical place where it had been was still somehow there. So how does a country just disappear? How can a country disappear? How do you represent the country to which you belong, which is no longer there? How to represent a country that's been there since before Roman times, but has never been a country as such in the modern sense of the word, and which in the 20th century became another country altogether? How to represent what was there once, is still there, and is no longer there? These are the issues that Said grappled with all his life, which is why the question of representation, I think, was so important to him, and at the same time was why representation always seemed to him to be so unsatisfactory. Quote, "I've always been interested in what gets left out," Said remarked in 1999. "I'm interested in the tension between what is represented and what isn't represented, between the articulate and the silent. What is represented and what is not, who creates the representations and who does not, what gets left out of the representations, contemporary, historical, was in a sense the intellectual focus of his life, along with the related question of how representation works, the tense relation, as it were, the theoretical, conceptual question of how representation works, that tense relation between word and image and thing, person or scene that it represents. This is doubtless, I think, why Said found Foucault so compelling, or at least he found him compelling for a while, particularly his book Les mots, les choses, which explores the tensions implicit in Said's own historical situation, words and things. For Said, though, perhaps not so much for Foucault, it was not simply an epistemological problem. It wasn't just a question about how to formulate knowledge about reality. Words and things, the translational axis of words to things, words to world, the worldly and the unworldly, or the illusory world of words, that was the paradigm on which Said focused. The possible effects of the disjunction between words and things was always for him weighted very definitely more towards things than words, leading him to ask the impossible question that hovers before him at the end of Orientalism, quote, "How does one represent other cultures?" But actually more urgent than that, in Said's case, for him, was the question, how does one represent one's own culture? In 1975, Said characterized the representational relation between words and things, its gaps and uncertainties in a literary context, with the unexpected term molestation. Molestation, he explained, I quote, "is a consciousness of one's duplicity, one's confinement to a fictive, scriptive realm. And molestation always occurs when novelists and critics traditionally remind themselves of how the novel is always subject to a comparison with reality and thereby found to be illusion." I think that was always Said's problem with literature, that at the end of the day, it was illusion. One can't help wondering why, however, Said picks that word molestation, a word whose dominant use concerns the sexual molestation of children and women by men. Why he used that to describe this gap between words and things. He evidently intends its weaker, now generally obsolete sense of disturbance. But there's something more at play here, I think. Why, of all words, pick that word? And it's hard not to link it to the sense that Said was always haunted by his memory of exile, which enforced a sense of molestation in the relation between representation and reality. Something had gone wrong for him in that typically natural link. The word hints at victimage, at violence, and perhaps a haunted sense of the reality that he'd left behind and which he could not now find again, or when represented even in words. The term molestation points to a scar of exile, to a heightened awareness of the way in which the text can produce only the illusion of the thing, the real, which always eludes us. Orientalism in that context becomes a book about Said's anger that the Orientalists had molested the East in their illusionary portraits of it, that their Eurocentric representations didn't at all properly conjure up a world and its human reality, the one that Said himself had experienced. It was, as it were, a translation that had no original. Orientalism, though, in a sense confronted a comparatively easy problem about the discrepancy between representation and the real. The argument required there to be a real, even if it didn't correspond to the Orient as such. Whereas Palestine was much more complicated than that. It had been real, but its historical and continuing reality now could not be represented. Perhaps that was why Said could not offer the counter-representation to Orientalism that he was much and justly, in my view, criticized for. That gap enforced the mind of winter of Said's émigré consciousness, the continual wound of loss, a constant awareness of the discontinuity, as he put it, between me out here and the actuality there. It's above all this that Said's writing gives us in all its pathos and power, a poignant, piercing sense of the discontinuity between us here and actuality there. For with Palestine, the actuality was both there and not there anymore. The place was also somewhere else, the people who'd lived there for the most part dispersed and initially left without even a way of describing who or what they'd been. Said's lifelong preoccupation with the questions and problems of representation and its conceptual limits can be framed and rethought, I think, from the perspective of the complex intertwining of memory with the trauma of loss and oblivion of the Palestinian people. Representation always proved more than a theoretical or philosophical problem for him. For him, it was always animated, as he put it in After the Last Sky, quote, by the problem of writing about and representing, in all senses of the word, Palestinians. In 1983, Edward Said commissioned an exhibition of Jean Mohr's photographs of Palestine at the UN. The UN, however, then, in its wisdom, prohibited any writing from accompanying those photographs. You can put the photographs up, they said, but you can't write anything about where they are or what they're portraying. Said's After the Last Sky formed a response to that injunction against a scriptory Palestine and developed into his first autobiographical account that sought to retrieve in writing and images a living actuality in the cultural memory of Palestine. The prohibition against attaching any words to the images at the UN exhibition staged in a bizarrely dramatic form the severance between representation and the real. Words or images were not allowed to point to each other that might point to things and to say what they really were. And Said's response to write the book offered the beginning of a process in which he succeeded, with many other Palestinians, in creating or recreating Palestine and Palestinians in their own imagination and in the imaginary of the world. In the need to stake a claim for the existence and identity of Palestinians who, in 1986, the year of After the Last Sky, remained for the most part an unacknowledged people, Said was obviously attracted to the photograph in particular because of what Roland Barthes calls the indexical quality of the image, the fact that the representation correlates to a moment of the actual that was once really there. And Barthes, as you recall in his book on photography, is taken by the way the photograph holds forever this sort of Proustian moment of an actuality of a lost time. But for Said, the exile, the dispossessed, the photograph involves a double loss of time and of place. The photographs have been commissioned to bring the reality of Palestinians to life, to make it real. Each photograph shows everyday details of Palestinian life, quote, not simply there, but represented by photographs as being there, saturated with meaning and memory, and still very far away. Said, however, feels uncertain that the photographs of Palestinians can actually fulfill their usual documentary or indexical role. I do not know, he said, quote, whether the photograph can or does say things as they really are. Something has been lost, but the representation is all we have. And photographs, moreover, could actually collude or facilitate in the loss of memory rather than bring it back. This is what he says. There is little I can truly remember about Jerusalem and Nazareth, little that's specific, little that has the irreducible durability of tactile, visual, or auditory memories that concede nothing to time, little that's not confused with pictures I've seen or scenes I've glimpsed elsewhere in the Arab world. Instead of providing the actuality that Said sought, photographs seem almost to take it away. How, though, to photograph Palestine? Do you photograph the place or the people, the majority of whom have become separated from it? The book is subtitled Palestinian Lives, and the photographs that Said chose are for the most part of people, drawing together a scattered, now imaginary or imagined community. We see Palestinians not only in former Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, but also all over the Middle East and Europe. Drawing the photographs together with his moving and evocative commentary, Said creates a kind of third space out of the crucible of Palestinian dispersion, its possibility drawn from the void of its non-existence, rather like Ireland's imagined fifth province, a dream of Palestine. In Israel-Palestine, each side dreams of a different past. Among the many ironies and reversals surrounding the history of Palestine, the forced exchange of dreams is amongst the most poignant. This dream of Palestine bizarrely mirrors the Zionist dream of Israel, which began as a dream of a lost past, but then succeeded in establishing itself in reality by evacuating the majority of Palestinians from their homeland, turning what for had generations been a reality for them into the dream of the lives that they'd lost. What's most noticeable, I think, in After the Last Sky is Said's sense of an emptiness of what actually constitutes Palestine and Palestinians. He complains, for example, and crucially, I think, that the Palestinian has no cultural capital, no Freud, no Einstein, no Rubinstein. It's a kind of void. How can we be a people, he seems to be saying, if we don't have a culture that we can point to? This lack of cultural capital, Said clearly feels, is a particular vulnerability, given that one of the arguments deployed against the Palestinians is, of course, that they don't exist. In Golda Meir's notorious words spoken 2 years after the 1967 war in an interview to the Washington Post, when I came to Israel, this is Meir, when I came to Israel in 1921, there was no such thing as a Palestinian people. When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? It was either southern Syria before the First World War, and then it was Palestine, including Jordan. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them. They did not exist. And Said, in After the Last Sky, seems to echo that extraordinary statement. Do we exist, he asks. What proof do we have? And his underlying project, I think, in that book is a very simple one, which is simply to prove the existence of Palestinians by representing them. Now, Meir's argument was made in 1967, which is a while ago, but in fact, versions of it can still be found in many forms today. Take, for example, the following entry to be found on wikianswers.com, which has 86 million visitors a month, is number 20 of the most popular websites internationally. This is a quote from wikianswers.com talking about Palestine. Of the peoples who inhabited this land in the second millennium BC, Israelites, bracket Jews, Edomites, Nabateans, Philistines, Phoenicians, and Canaanites, only the Jews still exist to this day as a nation, brackets. Definition of a nation equals common culture, language, geographical connection, and in the case of the Jews, a common religion, close brackets. Those other people no longer exist to claim the country as theirs. The vast majority, and this is still answers.com, the vast majority of today's Arab population who call themselves Palestinians are made up of two peoples whose ancestors began to come and live in the country from the Arabian Peninsula in the late 1600s or from Egypt during the Egyptian rule of Muhammad Ali. If those Arabs wish to call themselves Palestinians, that is their right, but they're not a distinct people any different in language, culture, or any other measure than the inhabitants of Jordan or to a certain extent Syria and Lebanon. And then there's a sort of adjunct paragraph which just says, never did Muslims refer to the land as Palestine before 1919. Now, if you're surprised to find such an assertive, one-sided view on a website like wikianswers.com, then if you look it up under Wikipedia, which has no relation to it, although they sound as though they're related, then you'll find the following information. The website is a primary product of the Answers Corporation, previously GuruNet, an Israel-based internet reference and Q&A company with offices in New York and Jerusalem, founded by Bob Rosenschein in 1999. And if you look up Bob Rosenschein, you find he's an American internet entrepreneur who moved to Israel in 1983. Similar statements about Palestinians can be found, of course, on many more overtly pro-Israeli websites. What's striking is that they share certain misapprehensions that, from a historical perspective, particularly from those schooled in the history of colonialism, seem scarcely credible today. Despite the appeal to ancient history, the preconceptions are in fact entirely modern. There are three key issues, I think. The first is, obviously, the very curious suggestion that only people who lived in Palestine in the second millennium BC have the right to claim the country as theirs. It would be very interesting to think what would happen if that logic was applied or put into practice everywhere else in the world. The second is the implication that the idea of the nation has remained consistent from the second millennium BC to today, which shows little, if no, historical understanding of the evolution of the idea of the nation and its relatively recent political institution of the nation state. And Akil yesterday was talking about the history of the nation state and the post-Westphalian sovereignty agreements that really created the modern nation state. Interestingly, the definition that WikiAnswers gives in its brackets of a nation is improbably, somewhat, but interestingly adapted from Joseph Stalin, from his definition of the nation in Marxism and the National Question, 1913. Stalin says, "A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, psychological makeup, manifested in a common culture," to which is added in the answers.com, of course, and in the case of Jews, a common religion. What WikiAnswers leaves out noticeably is the idea that a nation has a common history of people living in a particular territory over an extended period of time. While all the other people from the second millennium BC, it's argued, no longer exist to claim the country as theirs, bizarrely, no one who's lived in Palestine in the 4,000 years since the second millennium is allowed to have a claim on the territory either. When she said there were no such things as Palestinians, a very odd statement grammatically, which apparently works in Hebrew better than it works in English. At one level, may have been technically correct in the sense that the identity of Palestinians as Palestinian, in the way the word is used today, is relatively recent. But you could equally well say there was no such thing as Israelis before 1948. The logic of the idea that the Palestinians have no right to be a nation because they didn't formally call themselves Palestinians under Ottoman rule, if true, would apply in fact to most people around the world who lived under colonialism. As in the case of Palestinians, it was very often colonial rule in its various forms that forged and produced the nation. There were no, for example, Native Americans or First Nations in Canada before settlers arrived from Europe. But just because they didn't call themselves Native Americans, they didn't need to because they just lived there, didn't mean, of course, that they weren't there, and they don't belong there. Colonialism created new formations of indigenous people, scheduled tribes, we heard this morning, scheduled castes. New formations of indigenous people who arose in the context of shifting boundaries and forms of sovereignty, but who constituted themselves by virtue of their culture, ethnicity, and the locality of where they lived and had lived. If Palestine had simply become an individual separate state after 1945 in the same way as the other provinces of the Ottoman Empire that had been carved up by the Europeans, then Palestinians would have become Palestinians in a more regular way, in the way that Iraqis became Iraqis. They didn't, of course, get that option, but they became Palestinians anyway, by a different, far more painful route. Mohr's argument repeats exactly the kind of argument that was made by all colonizers against claims of indigenous inhabitants. The Palestinians, we're told, are not a distinct people. The assumption that the people of Palestine were just Arabs who could easily assimilate elsewhere in the Arab world when expelled from Israel was, I think, perhaps the major conceptual mistake made by Zionism and Israel in its military and political strategies. More charitably, you could say they were perhaps seduced by pan-Arabist ideology, but I don't think it was as complicated as that. What happened in 1948 was in itself, of course, by no means unique, and Amir was talking about that yesterday. There was, in fact, plenty of historical precedent for expelling people from their land. It could be argued that the Israelis were only following a well-established procedure, and not just that practiced in settler colonies such as Algeria, or in England in the 18th century in the enclosure movements, or the depopulation of the Scottish Highlands in the 18th century, or of Ireland in the 19th century. Relatively recently, much closer in time and also in space, there'd been the mass expulsion of Greeks from Turkey and of Turks from Greece around 1922, to say nothing of the Armenians, and of course European Jews from Europe. In 1947, there was a semi-forced exodus of millions of people between India and Pakistan. The 20th century, in fact, was the century of the managed mass transfer of peoples in order to create the nation-states that conform to the racial and cultural ideology of nationalism, as Hannah Arendt has famously said. For the most part, internationally sanctioned population transfers of the 20th century were deemed to be workable as well as morally acceptable because those who were expelled, let's say Muslims from Gujarat, notionally had somewhere to go to, that is, a homeland, even if they'd never actually had any connection with it before, namely, in that case, Pakistan. The mistake of Zionism was to assume that because the inhabitants of Palestine were simply Arabs, they therefore did not need a homeland, that as Arabs they were disposable people who could easily be deported to another Arab country where they just fit in indistinguishably. In fact, as we know, the majority of refugees from the newly created State of Israel did not assimilate into the other Arab countries, but ended up in vast refugee camps on the West Bank and Gaza. The rejection of the Palestinians by the Arab states, clearly not welcomed on grounds that they're just being generically Arab, was what enforced the Palestinian sense of themselves. And in that sense, it was, in a sense, Israel itself that created the Palestinians by expelling them. Though more accurately, the Arabs' defeat in 1967 created the breach or the historical crucible from which the Palestinian people developed self-consciously as Palestinians. Even if there were no Palestinians using the name Palestinian, there were people who lived in Palestine, and these people belonged to Palestine still. But their lack of a constituted national identity in modern terms within the framework of the modern nation state initially was what made it hard for them to make any claims. And it's this gap between a felt and a provable identity in today's terms that Said reflects and broods on in After the Last Sky. How can he represent or make a representation of a people who lack a proven empirical identity? The book is haunted by the intractable problem of having an identity that lacks an identity, a place that lacks a representation, a people who have no cultural capital to claim as their own with which they can identify, and no documented history that they can lay claim to. Do we exist, as Said said? What proof do we have? And then, the further we get from the Palestine of our past, the more intermittent our presence. When did we become a people? When did we stop becoming one? Or are we in the process of becoming one? His answer is that the people displaced from Palestine did not, in a sense, become Palestinians until 1967, when in a kind of Freudian Nachtraglichkeit, or deferred action, 1967 created the meaning and the collective memory of 1948 and precipitated the Palestinians into a national consciousness. And there's no better example of that deferred action than Edward Said himself, who you could say in some sense became a Palestinian and certainly a Palestinian activist after 1967. Asking the question about who the Palestinians are was part of the answer, part of the process of the development of a national culture that could be self-consciously represented and projected. As Frantz Fanon argued, quote, one cannot divorce the combat for a culture from the people's struggle from liberation. In other words, the national culture, the formation of the national culture is the struggle. Or as Said himself put it, and I think he was thinking in very Fanonian terms, our literature is in a certain way, in a narrow sense, is the elusive, resistant reality it tries so often to represent. Ever since, Said and other Palestinians have been producing a body of writing and cultural production, cinema, art, that both defines themselves as Palestinians and proves it to the world, even the Israelis. Today, the lack around Palestinian identity, cultural and historical, that Said laments in 1986, is, I think, no longer there. And if it's no longer there, it's in no small part thanks to Said himself. That generation of cultural capital makes it clear why, for example, even the West Eastern Divan Orchestra is so important. It's all about the fact that you exist. In the 1999 interview that I've already cited about the problem of who gets represented and what gets left out, Said continues as follows. In the particular case of the Palestinians, one of our problems is that we don't have any documents to substantiate what we said happened to us. Take one of the Israeli new historians, Benny Morris, for example. He's very literal-minded. He's an empirical historian, obviously. He's done very important work, but his assumption is that he can't say anything about what happened in 1947-48 unless there's a document to show for it. I say, well, why not try to animate that silence? Why not go through the process of trying to reconstruct out of the silence what was either destroyed or excluded? Now, that lack of representation that Said feels so viscerally there in that 1999, I think has now, in part at least, been answered. For example, the documenting of the Nakba by the historian Ilan Pape in The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Nur Masala's The Palestinian Nakba, Laila's Nakba, 1948, and then, for example, the remarkable archive photographs published in Ariel Azoulay's From Palestine to Israel, a photographic record of destruction and state formation, which is on sale in the bookshop here. So there's been a huge amount of historical work actually producing the very archive that even in 1999 Said was lamenting didn't exist. Whereas in 2001, Gabriel Peterberg could suggest that the claim that there'd been an ethnic cleansing of Palestine was still a matter of debate, it's become, I think, ever harder to deny. Representation no longer seems so distant from historical memory. The concerted attempts since 1948 to make Palestinians unbelong at every level has become ever more fully documented and challenged, and is now, of course, commemorated every year around the world on May the 15th, Yom HaNakba, the day of the catastrophe. And of course, as with the forbidden writing in the UN that then produced After the Last Sky, which will be read for generations, the more the commemoration is forbidden, the more it will be remembered. In the same way, whereas in 1986 Said cites what he regards as the tentative beginnings of the literary representations designed to restore Palestine, by the end of his life he was able to go much further. The remarkable, I think, outpouring of Palestinian literary writing after 1986, or you could say, which is the date of the book, but maybe after 1987, because what it's really been is a kind of amounted to a kind of artistic or cultural intifada, in effect. Allowed Said in his posthumous work, Late Style, to make the remarkable claim that by virtue of being late works, he says, quoting Adorno, are the catastrophe. And it's impossible, I think, that he didn't intend the Palestinian resonance when quoting that phrase from Adorno. He argues that by virtue of being late, Palestinian literature has in fact become now more powerful than Israeli literature. This is what he says. In the 20th century, great art in a colonial situation always appears in support of what Genet calls the metaphysical uprising of the natives. In Palestine, the same is true, since the radical, transformative, difficult, visionary work, Late Style, comes from and on behalf of the Palestinians, not from the Israelis. So representation, which for Said seemed so inadequate in many ways back in 1986, after 1987, has increasingly worked successfully as self-representation for Palestinian identity and history in the fight for a national culture. Even if what Said calls the Palestinian dream, which was also, I think, very much his dream, I quote, the perfect congruence between memory, actuality, and language, even if that remains as far away as ever. But the great achievement is that against all odds, all attempts to expel them physically, culturally, historically, personally, Palestinians do belong to Palestine still, even if Palestine does not belong to them. Not yet. Thank you.
Let me just, speak directly to what you explained, which the issue of such issues such as representation, narrative, memory, and identity, which seem to be of rather greater relevance to Palestinians nowadays. Particularly that I, for one, I'm Palestinian from Gaza. Next to me is a Palestinian student from the West Bank. Another is a Palestinian Syrian or Palestinian refugee from Syria. Another is a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And it was this chance for us to meet together. So for me, it seems that Palestine is rather also an idea, rather it's an idea, not an actuality. It's not a reality for me. I'm a Palestinian, but although Palestine is there, as you just pointed out, it's still inaccessible to me. Like, for example, the West Bank is a place that I cannot go to, that I cannot visit. Other places, for example, the village that I originally come from is also, or that my grandfather come from, is also inaccessible to me. So the place is there, this geographic space is there, but it's still not there, it's inaccessible. It doesn't exist for me. I belong to Palestine, or say I belong to the idea of Palestine, but I do not belong to the space or to this geography of Palestine. So I would say that, how would you say, do you think that there is a relationship between the Palestine being an idea and Palestine being an actuality? Do you think that Palestine being an idea, for example, again, this example of us existing here, the Palestinian students, we do not know one another, we do not belong to the same space, but we still think of ourselves as one, as part of one group, as part of one community, say this imagined community of the Palestinians, which do not exist in reality. Now, what united us is the idea of Palestine. So Palestine is an idea, it has this sort of dynamic which connects us to the actuality of Palestine. So Palestine being an idea affirms Palestine being an actuality. So is there a relationship between Palestine, the idea, and Palestine, the actuality? Do you think, for Said, for example, Palestine being an idea or an imaginative thing has affirmed the actuality of Palestine in his thinking? I'm not sure if my question is pretty clear, because I myself I'm confused, and I'm trying to sort of conceptualize Palestine. What is Palestine for me? I don't think of myself as Palestinian, but I am Palestinian. I was brought up as Palestinian, so I don't know. Yeah, just thinking out loud. Thank you.
I know I'm supposed to take the questions in threes, but I think, given the nature of that one, I'd ask Robert to respond to that first.
Well, I mean, everything you say, in a way, responds to what I was saying about the very difficulty that you have, and Said too seems to have had in putting these impossible things together. And of course, I mean, Palestine is there, but it's not there legally as a sovereign state in any sense. So, but I think what Said recognized, and this is what I was really trying to say, was in the process towards the achievement of either sovereignty or one state, should we say, normalized existence, democratic existence. Actually, culture and identity are really important. Culture isn't just an add-on, if you like, as it seems to be in most other societies, where it's a sort of a luxury, so to speak, that you add to your everyday life to try to make it a bit richer. In the case of the Palestinians, and I think this is where Said really drew on Fanon, because Fanon saw this absolutely as well. In the case of a people who are being told that they don't exist, that they have nothing distinctive about them, as in the Wiki Answers statement and so forth. It's actually to have your own cultural capital. I was using Bourdieu's phrase, but your own, as it were, sense of yourself as a cultural community and a community producing culture that is then visible or audible around the world. That actually really does, along with, as it were, all the other parts of the political process, recognition at the UN and so forth, these things are really important, and I think that's what Said recognized, that it's a really important part of that process whereby a people, as it were, become recognized as a people. And once a people are recognized as a people, they're in a very different situation from the point where it can be said that they don't exist, and therefore they don't have any rights. As soon as you have people who are, as it were, definable as Palestinians, then the whole situation is transformed. And I think that, as it were, did happen in the course of Said's life. And of course, Said himself was such a keystone in the arch of the creation of Palestinian identity, because he was such an extraordinary intellectual, but also so well known around the world and so forth. He himself was embodying the very thing that he was trying to create. But he, of course, did that too, and many other Palestinians, artists and writers, have been doing that. And I just wanted to, as it were, recognize the achievement that as it were, had taken place among Palestinians in the, whatever it is, 20, 30 years since After the Last Sky, where Said is very bleak, and he seems, as it were, to feel that they have nothing. But that very moment of saying they had nothing and then writing a book about it was the beginning of having something. And that was what was so important.
Okay, there are 3 people who want to come in, so I suggest we take those 3 together. And perhaps I could ask you, in making your questions, to be mindful of the pressure that we have on time. So do try and be direct if you can. At the back there, and then after that, in the front row here on the right. At the back first, you. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you see any parallel between the lack of national identity, as you put it, and the lack of representation in terms of the constitution of the lack as an instrument of the colonial mission in itself, and therefore the acceptable form of representation in this context being already a colonial instrument. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Arija, Palestinian student living in Nazareth inside Israel. I have 2 questions. The first is, do we become represented just if we became invisible to the West? And why I'm asking this question, today Israel celebrates its Independence Day. But the Palestinians in Israel since 1998 are marching to different displaced Palestinian villages. For 15 years now, thousands of Palestinians commemorate the Nakba. So, speaking of representing or the return of history, we are commemorating our history. Shall we, the whole time as Palestinians, as colonized, be the whole time preoccupied with the West and talking to the West about our Nakba? Because you mentioned Ilan Pape and Benny Morris and others, but Walid al-Khalidi talked about Plan D in 1961. So the issue of invisibility and knowledge, it's not the only issue that we Palestinians, we should be occupied with. Let's take an example, Obama, who is friend of Edward Said, who I don't know if it was a friend. He knows Edward Said, Rashid al-Khalidi, and others. And we all ask ourselves, he knows what has been going on. How then can we move from the question of representation, even if it's not enough, from representation to deconstructing the power relation, because we are, as Palestinian, I'm 3rd generation of the Palestinian living in Israel. We all know, my son, 6 years old today, said to me, Mom, don't be afraid, I'll be a good representative of you in this march, because I felt sad that I'm not there during this day. So I think we need this. We need the moving from the question of representation, because you talked about the media. The Facebook is full today of the Nakba, the archives. I work in the Israeli archives. We know this information. The Israelis themselves know the information. But it's not that the Israelis don't know that there were a Nakba or the Palestinians were displaced. But it is they say that you started or something like that. But it's not the issue of knowledge. knowledge or representation. It's an issue of the power relation. And this is which I think binationalism should be imposed from the international relations, and it's not related to neither information nor to representation. Thank you.
Our third question here.
Since you mentioned molestation, I want just to ask you if you still consider it valuable as a critical concept, also career, which in the beginning was some sort of representing the ontological project of the authorship according to the internal struggle between molestation and authority, especially connecting career with the later problem of philological inventory of the human and historical traces in the construction of our own identity and experience. Thank you.
Thank you. These are all problems that I can't solve. They're the problems we're trying to solve and trying to think of ways of solving. I mean, I think in terms of the first question about lack of representation, that of course is also, representation does that work too, as well. That's the issue. There is no representation in political terms. So it's extraordinary how many dimensions of the problem politically, I think, you can follow through from the word representation, certainly from the way that Said articulates it. I think what I'd say, I suppose, is, yes, of course, we're talking about power relations, as you said, but also about issues about visibility, and visibility is extremely important. And I think one of the things that you can see from the history of anti-colonial struggles is that visibility is in fact far more important in general, or not always more effective maybe, but often at least as effective as any other form of resistance. That as it were, to make yourself visible, and particularly to make yourself visible internationally, is the if you like, key anti-colonial card. And the person, I think, who played that card most brilliantly and most professionally was Gandhi, who absolutely knew how to make himself visible. He knew in the 1930s how important it was every time he stepped out on a march to have film cameras there who would make it into movies that would be shown around the world. And the degree to which individual anti-colonial struggles can make themselves visible internationally, given that as well, on the assumption that they have a reasonable case, which I think in this case we can assume, is actually how to create power, how to achieve power, because the historical precedent, if you look at what's happened over the 20th century, that kind of pressure, if it's kept up, and you never know, like in South Africa, you never know exactly when it's going to work and when things are suddenly going to crumble, but at a certain point they do, because at the end of the day, the good news, that if you want to hold on to some good news, is that basically people cannot live under military oppression forever, and there is no historical example whereby that's been a successful strategy, that in the end it always gives way. Sometimes it takes much longer than other times, but that's why the combination, I think, actually, the Palestinian strategy of sumud or resistance, non-violent resistance, plus the strategy of visibility and culture is a very strong means for asserting visibility, because if you think of again, as it were, the implicit assumption of any colonial rule is that the people being ruled are not equal to the people who are ruling them. And one of the ways that they make that argument is through arguments about race. Historically, you know, we're better than you, but it's also that as well, we're civilized and you're not civilized. And that's certainly been an argument that you can see being made in certain Israeli texts, for example. So as were the more pianists, Palestinian pianists you have playing in the world, the harder it is to play the game, that there shouldn't be a form of equality, and the harder it is to justify it. And so that's why the cultural work really does matter just as much as the political work, it seems to me. So visibility is in whatever form is key.
Right, well, thank you very, very much indeed. I would like you to join me in expressing your appreciation for Robert's presentation this afternoon.